Okay guys, now I'm going to talk about the object browser. And in the last video we saw where those references are that store all the classes that contain the definitions of all the objects you're going to use. Now we're going to look at where you can see all those classes. So let's just a brief review. A class defines an object. Also stated as a class is a blueprint for an object. So here's my class that we wrote earlier, basketball team. And the blueprint is that it's going to have a property called name. And that would create an object, right? A class allows you to create an object. And you could look at this class in what's called the object browser. If you click this icon here with the box with the other boxes popping out, or you press F2, you get to this object browser. And this allows you to search through all the libraries that we saw in the last video, as well as the code in your VBA project, and look at it from an object perspective. And it looks at all the classes and all the things that are contained in the classes. So if we go here and we put all libraries as this drop down, I should explain that you could select libraries like if you only want to look in the Excel library or the Office library or the VBA library, you can do that here. And these things, they correspond to what we saw in the last video, to DLL files stored on your computer. That's what this VBA, it says library VBA and it's telling you where it's at. And there's code in there that translates into what you see on the screen. If I change this to the Excel library, it'll tell you where it's at on your computer down here. It says library Excel, and it'll show you everything that's in it. It'll show you all these classes that are in the Excel library. And notice here's a column that says classes. This window says classes, and there's just tons and hundreds of classes. This is a class, Sheets View. I don't know what it does, but all this stuff is written for you. And this is what I was talking about in the last video, is that all you're doing when you're writing VBA code is working with these classes, and you're choosing a class and picking the members of the class. And the members of the class can be, let's say you choose this workbook class, you can choose this member, which is a property. So here's a property, active chart, and it's defined as a chart object. We'll get to that in a second. But notice it says this property is a member of the Excel library and the workbook class. And it's real easy to see that. So even though you couldn't go to that .dll file and open it up on your computer, this object browser does it for you. It organizes it in a way where you can pick a library, you can look in the library and see all the classes, you could select a class and see all the members in that class, and there's going to be there may be hundreds of members, and then you could see what's going on with those members. And one thing to note is that the icons will tell you what the members are. So if you see this icon, it's a property, that hand with the envelope. If you see the green box with like some speed lines behind it or something, it's a subroutine or a function. If you see this icon, which is a lightning bolt, it's an event. And we already know what those things are. We already know what subroutines are. We already know what functions are. We already know what events are. We already know that. We already know what objects are, right? And we already know what classes are. So we wrote a class here, in fact. And we can look at that class in the object browser if we go to the VBA project library up here, and we can see that now we have in the window we have basketball team, which is this basketball team, which is this is the class we wrote, and it's in the classes window. So if I click on it, now I see private class basketball team. It's a member of the VBA project. So this is telling me It's identifying this class, and it's also showing me what's in the class. There's two members. One is a name. It says public property name. So this is a property, and it's a string. It's defined as a data type of string, so it can hold strings. And it's saying it's a member of the VBA project, basketball team class. The other member is a private variable called team name, and it's defined as a string. And if we look at this to see these two members, you can double click on the basketball team, and you can see that here's that private variable called team name, and this whole thing, all this code, it encompasses the name property. Notice that you have sort of two properties, two versions of the name property, a get version and a let version. But when you look at the object browser, it only shows you, a general thing that says property name. Because in reality, there is only one name property. The get and the let are sort of things done behind the scenes that you don't need to really show that here. Also, you should note that when you write in modules, I referred to all these things here as modules throughout the class so far, and I referred to them that way because I didn't want to bring up classes right away, and I also wanted to just make it sort of intuitive that these are a place where you can write code. You could double click and you could write code here. But if you look at the object browser, how does the object browser interpret these elements in these folders? You could see that it interprets it as a class. It's in the class window, like this functions module. There's a functions class here, which matches what's in the functions module here. So these are in fact interpreted as classes. And you could see that because the three members here, convert to Celsius, return 1, and test functions, if I scroll up, you can see test functions is a subroutine, and return 1 is a function that returns an integer, and convert Celsius is a function that takes a parameter of type double and returns something of type double. You can see that we wrote that code. Earlier in the class, we wrote all this code, and now we can see it in the object browser. And we can actually see that this is interpreted as a class with these subroutines and functions. Now, how does this enable you to write VBA code and become good at it and write some very sophisticated subroutines and functions and all this stuff? Well, let's go back to the all libraries, and let's just take a look at these two windows here. So if you look at all libraries, look at how many classes you have access to. We had to take time and write this class, but we don't have to write anything to get access to these classes. They're already written for us. So if you scroll down, there's hundreds and hundreds of classes, and within each class there's members that are properties, subprocedures, or functions or events, and you don't even have to write them. And this is what you're working with when you write VBA code. You are accessing the VBA object library, and you're using members in a class. And there's just hundreds of classes within each class. Literally, if you scroll through, there's thousands of different members in total and hundreds of different classes. And this is all you're doing when you write VBA code. So I think when people start out learning VBA, they don't really get to this point, and then they're always sort of uncertain as to, like, what do I use and how do I code this? The object library, it tells you what you can do. This is it. This is all you can work with, unless you want to write your own classes. This is all you can work with. So, and it's really helpful because it tells you, for instance, if there's parameters into subprocedures, it tells you what type of, this parameter needs to take this data type. So you can't pass in a number like an integer to this. This needs, it tells you what data types are necessary as parameters. It tells you whether they're subroutines or functions or properties. It's very helpful. So let's look at a quick example of this, just so we get an idea of how the object browser can be used. If I do sub test object browser and I put a message box around this, so let me type some code: application.sheets.count. When I run this code here is going to show me the number 4 because there's 4 worksheets in my workbook. And that's what this code does. Now, let's use the object browser to see what objects we are working with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to search for application in here. When I search for it, I notice there's a class called application. And that's what we're going to look into. But you'll notice when you search for something, I put an application, it finds anything in the library or the class or the member column that has application in it. So let me click on application because I know I have to start with a class, right? You always want to start with a class when you're looking in this object browser. So I look into the application class. So I search for application and I just I click on it, and then over here it automatically shows me that application has a little border around it, and it says in this window, here's all the members of application. And as I told you before, a class is composed of properties, which are this icon, and functions or subprocedures, which is this icon, and events, which can be that icon. These are all written for you. So we looked at application.sheets. That dot operator, that period here, this allows you to access the members of the class. So that dot gives me access to everything over here in this window. And if I scroll down, I have access to all this stuff, but I did application.sheets. And if I look at that, here it is, right here, application, here's the application. Now I do dot, it gives me access to all the members, and I did sheets. And then what I did another dot, right? Over here, I did another dot. So what is this dot doing? Well, this dot tells you that you're accessing functions or subprocedures or properties of this object. So this must be an object. When I say that, the comparison I'm making implicitly is that this must be an object because you can't use a dot on something like an integer. Like you can't do this. You can't do dim x as integer and then do x dot, message box x dot something, because there's nothing there, right? X is just an integer. And that's something to note, is that these are not like primitive data types. These are not something like integers or longs or dates. All these variables that we have over here, like byte, boolean, currency, long, single, those are called primitive data types because you can't do much with them. They just store numbers, or they store dates, or they store variant, or they store string things, right? We know what they do. They just store something. Versus these things, this is an object, and because it's an object, I can use the dot operator and access properties, functions, subroutines and events. So what am I doing now? If I do sheets dot, what am I actually doing? Well, let's go to the object browser again. Remember, we used the dot operator once already to get to this point where we did application dot, and then we had access to all these members, and then we did sheets, application.sheets. But now when I do the dot again, I'm accessing the members of whatever class sheets is. The sheets is a property but it comes from a class called sheets. It doesn't always happen that way, but in this case it does. And because it is coming from a class called sheets, that dot operator, it's the same as me, if I click this, it's the same as me having access to all the members of the sheets class. So here's the sheets class. That now has a border around it. Now I have access to all these members. And what did we do? We did application.sheets.count. And there's count. And count is a property in the sheets class. You see that? And it's defined as long. So this is just like a primitive property. A property with a primitive data type. So you can't then do, if you go back over here, you can't do count dot anything because it's primitive. It's an integer, long, or whatever. It's not an object. You can only use this dot operator on an object. And that, hopefully this clarifies exactly how you are going to use objects when you're writing VBA code. All you're doing is accessing members of a class. And then if the member you accessed is an object, then you can access the members of the whatever class that object is from, right? So here we started out, let's look at this real quick. We started out in one class, the application class. Here, we started out in this application class. It had members in it. And we ended up in the sheets class here, right? In the sheets class. And that's why VBA is so powerful, because all this code is already written for you. It does really cool stuff like find the count of number of worksheets, but it can do much more cooler stuff, and you didn't need to write any of it, and it's done for you very succinctly. In just this bit of code, you are starting in one class, accessing its members. If the member is an object of another class, you can then go into that class and access those members. So we started out here, and then we ended up here. So that's really powerful stuff, and you'll see that there'll be times when you can do like 4 or 5, you can use the dot operator 4 or 5 times. And keep doing like dot da da da, because this would be an object, and you access another member function, and then dot da da da, and all you're doing is accessing objects, and then finally you would end up with a long integer, a primitive data type. So one other thing to note is that these dot operators, you can see how what they're doing in a sense is sort of telling you where stuff comes from, right? Like this count comes from a sheet object. It's a property in the sheets class, and because it's coming from a sheets class, that means this is a sheets object. The sheets object is coming from, where is that code? That code is in the application class, right? So we're sort of, you can trace back, if you do count, if you search for count, let me search for sheets. We started here and we were at count, right? Count is a member of sheets. If you click on sheets, class sheets, we knew from earlier that sheets is a member of application. And so you could go back, you could keep going back and back. An application is a member of Excel. So you can even do this. If you double click this, you know how we saw that it said Excel dot? You can do the same thing in here. Oops. You can do Excel dot. and you see how it says excel.application? That's what's going on with the object library. It's telling you where stuff comes from. It's telling you what classes things come from. Application comes from the library Excel. So it all starts with a library, and that's what the object browser does. Like I told you at the beginning, here's all the libraries you have to choose from. Within them you have classes, and within the classes you have members. The members can be primitive stuff, like an integer property or a long property, or it can be an object stuff, or it can be a data type object, which means you have access to that object's class, as we just saw. One last thing is that this is called fully qualifying your object. You don't need to fully qualify most objects. You don't need to put excel.application.sheets. If I run this, it comes back with the value 4. If you take off the Excel dot, the VBA code is smart enough to know that application is in Excel. You don't need to write it. And you could even knock off the application dot. So you could just do sheets.count, and you'll get the value 4. That's about as far as you can knock off. You can't knock off this and just put count, because it doesn't know what object the count property is associated with. So you don't need to fully qualify your objects. Like in this case up here, message box application.name. If you can't just do this name. You need the application, because in that case you want the name of the application, right? And don't freak out about what needs to be fully qualified and not. You'll see as you start coding, as we move through the class, we're going to have a lot of coding examples that most things are not fully qualified, going all the way back to Excel, library, dot application, dot, and whatever. You don't need to put Excel.application for most things. 99.9% of things you don't need to do that. Actually, more than 99.999% of the time. So basically, you don't need to fully qualify stuff. And that's the power of VBA. I would encourage you to go to the object browser and just go and search through these libraries and see what's in them. Most things you're going to have no idea, but you're just going to get a feel for what VBA is. It's a language that's composed of classes and members in the class. And here you see, like, this member caption in this class here is a string. It's a primitive data type. But other properties, I'm trying to find one here. Other properties like this is a property that's not a primitive. And that's where Excel sort of confuses people, but this should be perfectly clear by now, that you can have a property with a data type that's not primitive, which means you can click on this and now you have access to all these members. So I encourage you to look through the libraries and try to make the connection that you're dealing with classes, you're dealing with members, and look down here to see where stuff comes from and what parameters things have and things like that. In the next video, we're going to get into the macro recorder, because now at this point in the class you might think we haven't written a lot of code, meaningful code, but what we have done is that we've laid a foundation where you know exactly where everything's coming from. You know about functions, subprocedures, variables, events, and you know about classes and what they do. And we know where they're, what we're working with, where we're going to be working with all these classes and their members in a similar way that we just saw, doing things like this, using the dot operator on an object and accessing its properties, functions, or subprocedures. So now you have the foundation, and from a very broad perspective, that's all VBA programming is exactly what this video covered. It's using this dot operator to go from one class, to go from the application class to the sheets class, and that's what this line does. So everything from here on out is going to be pretty straightforward, I believe, because now you know what these dots are and what these terms in between are. They're objects of some sort, and we're just playing with these objects. So that's all VBA programming is. It's not hard. All you're doing is playing with what's given to you, and what's given to you is all this stuff. Hundreds of classes, thousands of members in sum total, and VBA is really powerful because of this. So we'll move on and we'll start writing code, more sophisticated code, and we'll be using these objects now. Up until this point, we haven't really used these objects in these classes, but now we're going to start using them, and it should be exciting for you.